This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
We're asking about the issue of the maternal voice, which seems to come up in different ways in all the sessions, or the absence of a maternal voice, and this recurring problem of finding text with a mother's voice seems to be Jill has struggled with. I don't know, it's not really a question as such, just I wondered if there were more thoughts really, why? What is it about maternal experience that cannot perhaps be articulated or doesn't seem to be able to be articulated in conventional narrative perhaps? Is there something about literary tradition that weighs down upon others who write about mothering?
That comes up with what we were hearing about the Eastern text and a contrast between producing a text and producing a baby, which is actually quite anti-traditional, because all the writers up to now said the reverse in a way, that that creative process, one can be a metaphor for the other, and so it's quite interesting that is a kind of, could be seen as a maternal voice. When a woman writer writes, she's the mother of her text, and that's her voice in it. But it seems that Houston is rejecting that parallel, that analogy. And is it a convincing rejection? And why is one selfish and the other unselfish? Is it because of, well, I don't know why.
I think the specialist summarising. This came up in the question we talked about ethics, that not in the text that we read, but another essay from the same volume. This text that we read for this session was published in a volume of essays, and another text in this volume talks about this ethical dilemma. It's called le dilemme de la romancière. So Houston invents this word which incorporates novelist and mum in one word, which we talked about as well in our session. And for Houston, she talks about this dilemma, this apparent dilemma, between the ethics of being a novelist and the ethics of being a mother. And so it puts into question whether this is not as clear-cut, that being a mother is a selfless position and being a novelist is selfish. I mean, this is something that we talked about as well in our session. That's a very problematic distinction to make, but that a mother, an idealized mother, is a caring person, and a novelist needs to be able to kill off her characters. And so she puts this quite bluntly, it's fairly bad qualities for being a mother to want to kill off characters. So this is something that she plays out in talking about these two roles quite explicitly in her non-fiction text, but then she discusses how to carry out both of these roles more implicitly in her fictional writing, where she has mothers who are also artists who then abandon her daughters, or who, through deciding to pursue roles as artists, for example, talked about two novels, Slow Emergencies and Prodigy, where the mother, after childbirth, falls into mental illness, and by the time the daughter's 10, she has a complete mental breakdown, and nurse effectively abandons the daughter through mental illness, and how this is another form of abandoning the children and a conflict of interest between mother as artist, whether through musician or dancer, and how to reconcile these roles of mother and artist and be a successful mother. And I think she's much more forgiving in her fictional writing, read in the light of her non-fictional writing, where she's speaking of her own mother and her abandonment, and much more forgiving in her fictional writing, where these are more forgiving in this sense. So these ethical questions we talked about in our session as well, which she she raises in interesting ways.
The problem in what she's saying though is configuring the author as the creator of the characters rather than the author as the creator of the text, which contains characters. You might let characters die in the text, but you're still the creator of the text. You don't kill the text. And it seems to me the text is the baby, not the characters in it. But
can I say something about Alifara? It's a fictional text, although Motherhood is a fictional text, although there are some quite strong autobiographical elements. I think the distinction is Dominica, the protagonist in the text, becomes a mother, and motherhood is described in very positive terms as a reason for to reforge those connections with previous family members living elsewhere, to create a community, a network of women. Where the problem seems to be is the mother of the protagonist. So there doesn't seem to be a problem talking about the next generation, as long as the child doesn't constitute a threat to the protagonist's identity. But what does constitute a threat is the mother of the protagonist. So it's the previous generation which is silenced, and it's the adult figure that seems to need to separate from the mother in order to forge her own identity, rather than the relationship with the child, the young child especially, being the problem. Does that make sense?
I think that's if you look at it in psychological or psychological terms, that's the sense that your parents are relative to your own structure of identity.
Yeah, absolutely.
Although however much investment you have in your children, they're not actually in the same way constituent of your own identity. They are to a certain extent, but not in that same way. But also in that, I haven't read the whole book, but is her child silent? I mean, do we hear that? What sort
it's
of...
It's difficult in a way because that absolutely happens right at the end of the text, and so the child is still very, very young. So doesn't have his voice in the novel for that reason.
that was of course a decision on the author's part to decide
not to
continue
continue that.
I was just going to ask, with back what you were saying about the psychic structure and relationship with the mother, explain why there is so little of mother narratives, because then any narrative will be about that relationship, or could be about that relationship between the daughter and the mother, and not from the mother's point of view. You see what I'm saying? This is a mother with a daughter.
I mean, there's an awful lot of writing from the point of view normally of adult children in relation to their own mothers, and not so much from the point of view of mothers. So what is good is that you do get the perspective of the mother. There's what you possibly then lose out is perhaps the dialogue with the child. That can be for all sorts of reasons. One of the French writers who writes a lot about her own mother will ask sort of when she writes about sexuality, and it's quite a lot of abortion and things like that. When asked, is there a taboo subject for you? And she's just my children. So she writes very little about being a mother, actually. So I think that's sort of perhaps one side of it.
There's an exact parallel with the Spanish writing at the moment. He says, in a way, my whole career I've been writing about my relationship with my mother, but now she's finally produced her memoirs, and she says, the one thing I'm going to talk about is my children. Again, exactly the same. Ad nauseam, sex, no holds barred, and mother, and nothing about being a mother.
In some sense, the problem with the maternal voice, or the issues about the maternal voice, is maybe we don't want to hear it. We don't want to hear about that ambivalence and its various, or we say we,
As a culture,
if you think about Rachel Cusk and the perception her book had, and a number of times I've seen her sort of writing about how shocked she was about how people reacted to her book. It's sort of rather best maternal.
And is it especially true that migrant mothers are silent? Like possibly, you think about language mothering in another language, something that came up that I was sorry to come up.
I was thinking that perhaps there are obvious issues, perhaps of very basic protectiveness. One doesn't want to write about one's children for a variety of very practical social reasons, but also paradoxically for the opposite reason to what writers like Richard Kosk or others might have had at the root of their writing, which is that I'm reminded of the old Tuscan definition for a woman who is very carnal of her children. In other words, that voltage of maternal passion which exists in most or in some of those who have given birth and are with children. I'm thinking of the Greek poets whose life was wrecked by the intensity of feeling versus what the social situation allowed them to express. They died of that impossibility. So there is also, I think, at the root of much silence, a sense of great guardedness, which is almost proportional to the intensity of the feeling, perhaps.
But also a bit of stigma, I would say. For example, if we take like photographers, I mean, I would talk about artists, mother photographers, like Thierry Guéron, who had a whole scandal with Saatchi and Saatchi when they closed down the whole gallery because she exhibited this kind of prolific pictures in which she's kind of portraying herself, her mother, and her children. And they were kind of, and she was accused of all of things because, yes, the images are really kind of provocative, but I mean, probably every mother can kind of relate to them in a way and to that experience, or Sally Mann, for example. So I think that, I mean, if that exhibition, if you kind of expose your kind of true life to detail, and photography is probably different, it's a different medium, but I think there is a bit of stigma as well of how much you can kind of expose. And for example, I'm also using a lot of autobiographical writing in my own performance, and I always get that, well, but is this ethical, what you are talking about your children on stage, you know, is this real, is this, you know, it's kind of like I get that a lot about the anecdotes that I'm sharing on stage. Are they real or not? You know, they somehow the ethics of it. Yeah, is it true? You know, it's kind of like how much they want to hear and how much should remain fictional, actually. And so I think that there is a bit of, I mean, I don't know, stigma probably is a difficult word, but yeah.
That's why fiction is so good, because it can just be behind it, if you like, in a way, but it can also, it can, through metaphor and sorts of images, convey those.
But to me, what's interesting is that the stigma is equal, and tell me if you agree with this, but to me, it feels like there is equal stigma on voicing ambivalence or downright negativity as on voicing extreme and passionate love for one's children. It's all very well if we say, okay, and we stay as mothers or as writers and we're in that safe middle ground, a bit of humour and a bit of, but if we deviate from that and we give full rein to whatever may be our feelings, that is when the stigma, and that is the same perhaps thing that happens in art in general. You know, we want, or art consumers want to be seems reassured or kept in a certain happy zone, which so it's kind of a problem, I think. I don't know if you would see it that way.
I wanted to pick up what you were just asking about the voice of the migrant mother. What I'm doing is I'm taking literary texts, looking at certain themes which occur in those texts, and then I go out and talk to migrant mothers as one of the groups. And yes, I don't feel that they have a voice when English becomes the medium. I don't think they have the power to express themselves. I don't think, I mean, it's the literary texts are great, but they are open to a certain audience and they are written by a certain type of woman as well. So this mother with those 3 kids, who probably has not got the language capability to express herself, will never have this medium. And she will use her children to translate for her. Often the children just pick up so much quicker the language, and they are so much quicker familiar with the customs and with a certain culture, which we're probably just going to talk about in a moment anyway in the text to follow. But yes, I do think there are silence. I do think that I think they're still on the margin, and I think their voices are not heard. They're not heard, or they're not present. They're not present, well, particularly of migrant mothers, apart from the mothering experience as an experience by itself, and then writing about it and so on. But yeah, and then another thing I wanted to say, there's another text about the experience of being a mother, and that's written by Slavika Drakulic, and that's called As If I Wasn't There. And the main character, the epic, is the experience of being raped during the Bosnian War and having a baby and coping with the fact that she's actually going to have this baby and become the mother of this baby. That made it just interesting to add to the literary testimonies, if you like. Obviously, it's a fictional text, obviously. I mean, she's done her research from what I know and spoke to women who had similar experiences and has then fictionalized it all, has put it into art again in a medium where we can use metaphors, so where we can probably convey ideas which we wouldn't be able in an everyday conversation, because I don't think that this women would be happy to sit down and talk about it, which is what brings us back to some of the very sensitive issues we touched in our breakout sessions, where they say where the Somali women say we don't want to be talking about this is my body. Let's talk about social realities. So I don't think that but just to add, that's another text if anybody's interested.
So you're comparing literature schools then with oral narratives?
Well, I'm using it, yes, it's with oral history, if you like, old life stories. I'm looking at 3 different generations of women migrants. So women in their early 20s, women my age, which is in their mid-30s, and then women in their late 50s. For various reasons, just because I think that their experiences are different. They are in a different social structure, in a different reality. And also because I'm looking at women coming from the eastern part of Europe. So they have experienced a different political system, which I'm interested in as well. And they were never allowed to travel and are now traveling for other purposes than, So I'm using the literature as a vantage point, and but none of the texts I'm using has got this mothering aspect to it, so I can't really use them. I'm looking at That's Not Managed Bluebird, and then I'm looking at Kapka Streets Without a Name, which is, I don't know if this is familiar, but there is not much on mothering really. I mean, yes, there's where Kafka talks about her mother trying to buy them shoes, and she brings her into the narrative, but it's not her experiencing mothering. But again, what you were saying earlier, the grown-up child talking about the mother and reminiscing and remembering the mother. So, I know. Yeah.
Any other comments on that?
Can I just ask a question? noticed that all of us mentioned this autobiographical element, but at the same time, fiction. We never said this is an autobiography. I was just wondering if that kind of fluidity of format is intrinsic to these experiences, or is more fit to these experiences. I'm just wondering your thoughts were on that. But the three texts have that ambivalence.
Can I just say on this as well? Sorry, I had the opportunity to meet Kafka Koselova, and she names her text. She says it's a memoir, so kind of draws a line and takes herself out of it, but at the same moment it is clearly autobiographical. And then talking to her about this, where is your position in this, and is this autobiographic or? I think I kind of had the impression, and again, this is a very personal judgment, if you like, that she wants to stay the creator of the text and the artist, and leave us as the audience, or maybe me as the reader, to give me some reflection on this, and stay in this distant place where you don't really know whether this is fiction or is this real. Just as you were saying a little bit earlier, when you stage something or you perform some of this autobiography, you do want to have the boundaries slightly fluid for
Is it like a defense mechanism? It's like a defense mechanism, protection oneself.
It grants you a license
Yeah,
to articulate
exactly.
things that aren't, as we discussed, generally articulated in other disciplines.
But also maybe it's a false boundary in any speaking. Flaubert could say Madame Bovary, c'est moi, in a way. As soon as you write something, it's fictional, and everything you write comes from within. And so to say, okay, up to here it counts as fiction, and from here on it's autobiography, I think it's very open to dispute how useful it is to try and draw that line in the first place. We're talking about people's writing which comes out of their own experience, whether they've changed their names around or haven't. Either way, it's a kind of alchemy of life becoming words on the page, isn't it?
And speaking from the perspective of Italian literature, I agree that this is it has autobiographical elements, and that can be used as a strategy to speak about things that you might not be able to speak about in the first person. But I don't think it's intrinsic to the genre, because we were talking earlier about the canon in Italy and how difficult it's been for migrant writers, to be taught in Italian universities, to find their way into the accepted Italian canon. And one of the reasons they were perhaps dismissed it was because they were criticised for being too autobiographical. They were just dismissed as autobiographical texts rather than works of literary works. And a lot of the earlier migrant writers were very pure. Shouldn't really use that word, but they were autobiographies, and they were perhaps dismissed as literary texts because of that. And it's perhaps only more recently that there's been a move towards these fictional texts, which we're now talking about. So I don't think it's intrinsic to the genre of migrant writing. There's other things going on.
Has in Italy and other has the sort of generic boundaries changed in literature? Because I would say in French, I don't know if you agree, Kate, but the sort of generic boundaries between what was the novel and autobiography sort of just don't exist anymore. It's much more of a sort of continuum, where you just got sort of things that are more or less fiction and more or less autobiographical. And I don't know if that's the same everywhere.
I think that certainly applies to Spanish, I think.
And particularly women's writing, maybe? I don't know.
Not necessarily, I would say. Not necessarily.
I think that this is a thought, I don't know if it's very well formulated, but with relation to motherhood and autobiography and the text as a child, that reading women's writing in terms of motherhood and autobiographical writing or not leads to a certain kind of entrapment that's particularly susceptible to reading as autobiographical, because we could fall into the trap of reading a woman's text to do with motherhood as autobiographical, whether it's about motherhood or not, because of this trope of a woman's text is her child, whether she has children or not, because women either have children or write texts. If they don't have children, then they write texts. It's a substitute for a child. So she can't win.
So, but it's just really just a question. Where does the genre of auto-fiction come in? Does it still exist?
Where does it come in?
Well, what you said that now there's no boundaries anymore between novel and...
Well, there's always labels, aren't there? I mean, they still use novel, I think still pretty fictional, auto-fictional. I don't know how much that exists in other literatures, but it's a particular type of autobiography, fictionalizing, but using the name of the writer. Yeah. So it seems like it's autobiographical, but actually also fictionalizing it. So the reader never knows which it is. So there's always, it has to be slippery.
Yeah.
We're getting away a bit from motherhood here.
That's not the case. So thank you very much again to our summarisers and to all of you. We've got a quarter now, I think, copies, but that's fantastic.